Welcome back. In this next segment, we take on one of two important areas of social relationships and social interaction that help to color every early childhood learning setting. We're going to talk now about peer relationships, and who can doubt that the early childhood years are a time of tremendous growth in children's abilities to get along with other children, to be able to resolve conflict with children, to be able to develop more and more sophisticated social skills for interacting with other children, as well as developing close friendships with one or a small number of other peers. Truly it is that peer relationships are an important developmental accomplishment of this period of life, but it's also true that peer relationships color every early childhood learning setting, so that children's abilities to get along with other kids, to enjoy working cooperatively with other children, to interact with them in ways that are constructive and positive, shape the learning experiences they have. In this way, social and emotional development is truly foundational for the growth of the mind and for early learning. And it's partly for this reason that the California Preschool Learning Foundation section on social emotional development really has not one but two strands that focus on peer interactions and peer relationships. The first you'll find on page 12, where the strand focuses on children's interactions with peers. And there are actually three parts to this strand. One of them focuses on the ease with which children can interact with other children in an early childhood classroom. And so it talks first of all about the extent to which children are active and intentional in their cooperation with other children and have the social skills for doing so. The next section focuses on one kind of peer interaction, namely pretend play. It's not the only kind of play, it's not the only kind of play that's important, but it is a kind of play that is rich and deep in social interaction. And so this part of the strand talks about the extent to which children can participate in sequences of pretend play that initially are fairly simple and later become much more complex, that involve planning and coordination and cooperation. And the third part of the strand talks about conflict resolution, and that fact that because conflict occasionally erupts in every kind of peer interaction, that part of the developmental process we see here is the ease and the skill with which children can resolve conflict that erupts between themselves and other children, and their movement from initially, of course, seeking assistance, especially when disagreements have erupted into physical aggression, to, at the older age, increasingly being able to negotiate with other children themselves, as well as seeking adult assistance when needed. So interactions with peers is an important strand in the social-emotional foundations. But there's another strand that is equally important, and it has to do with developing friendships at this age. And that too is an area in which we see significant developments, from at about 48 months, children choosing to play with one or two special peers whom they identify as friends, to at the older age, finding that friendships are not only broader, may include more than one other child, but are more reciprocal, that is, there's more back and forth, more mutuality. Friendships are more exclusive. Children may, in fact, deliberately seek to not only play with their friends, but exclude other children, and friendships are also more enduring. And what all this shows us, of course, is that even in early childhood, children's peer relationships are surprisingly complex and are surprisingly sophisticated. That if we casually watch all the things that are going on in children's interactions with other children in the preschool years, we have to be amazed at the social skills that are developing in this period of life, at the social sophistication we can see before our eyes. One of the things I tried to do is to simply write down the varieties of social skills and social knowledge that is required, and you can see that I came up with quite a list, and it didn't even exhaust all the things that we know about the development of peer relationships in this stage of life. But let me highlight some of them for you just to give you a flavor for all the things that are happening in children's abilities to learn to interact with other kids. First of all, children need to learn initiation skills, because even our most casual observation of children of this age shows that if one child walks up to two others who are playing in the sandbox or in the block area and says, "Can I play with you?" more often than not, they're going to get a negative response. Children know that. And so one of the things they have to learn are new kinds of initiation skills that are more indirect than direct, that enable a child to become part of the play of other children whom they want to join, but do so without requiring a direct invitation to do so. That can involve parallel play that eventually becomes integrated with the other kids. It can involve talking with one of the children and eventually becoming part of their play group as you're doing so. But that's a sophisticated ability, because most of us as adults are much more direct in our initiation. There are social maintenance skills. In other words, the skills that are involved in knowing what to do to keep interaction going positively, going constructively, going well once you've started interacting with another child. And a lot of that involves knowing how to be both a positive partner, how to be a cooperative partner, but also how to be appropriately assertive. How to stand up for yourself, but also how to allow others to stand up for themselves. And that's a delicate balancing act that children are working hard on in this stage of life. Part of what's involved in social maintenance skills is how to manage conflict and aggression. Because that will happen, that will creep up. Children will disagree with each other. They'll want something the other child has, and if every time that takes place, conflict escalates into aggression, peer interactions will rarely go successfully. And so children themselves have to figure out how to detect when things are going badly, how to become aware when another child is getting upset, and what to do in such a way that doesn't permit things to go off track. You know, with my students, when I'm talking about peer relationships in the early childhood years, I often describe to them a favorite story that actually came out of a research article on conflict management tactics in preschoolers, because it really reflects, I think, the kind of social sophistication that you see. This is an observation that the researcher did of a couple of 4.5-year-olds who were walking down the street one day, and as children will do, and you'll quickly realize these are two boys, one begins a fantasy, imagining. He says, "I'm a missile robot. I can shoot missiles out of my hands and out of my feet. I'm a missile robot." And his friend, walking alongside him, decides that he's going to tease him a little bit, so he says, "No, you're just a fart robot." And the first child is somewhat surprised, and he says, "No, I'm a missile robot. I can shoot missiles out of my head and out of my feet." And the other child won't back down. He says, "No, you're just a fart robot." Well, the first child is beginning to get upset because his whole fantasy is being tipped awry. And so he says, "No, Josh." And Josh, beginning to realize that this is getting out of control, immediately turns to his friend and says, "And I'm a poo-poo robot." And Josh says, or the other child says, "I'm a pee-pee robot," and the boys go along happily. You can tell that those were two boys, of course. And what that reflects, of course, is the social sensitivity that's required to manage conflict, both to become aware of the social cues you're getting from the other child, and once you've interpreted those cues, hopefully correctly, is the ability to enact a new strategy that will keep things going along well. Children who have different social skills are differently skilled in this conflict management domain. Managing play, pretend play, and otherwise. Now, the preschool learning foundations in the social-emotional domain for interactions with friends, we talk a lot about pretend play. And again, it's not because that's the only kind of play that's important, but because it is a kind of play in which there's such a depth and richness of social interaction that it becomes literally a forum for the development of social skills in the ways that other kinds of play do not. And boy, if you ever needed more evidence that children of this age are not egocentric, take a look at their pretend play. Because anytime you've got 2 or 3 or 4 kids enacting a dramatic imaginary play scenario together, what you quickly observe is that for most of the time, these kids are not only in the role of actors, that is, playing the part that they're playing in this imaginary scenario. They're also playing the role of a stage manager as they're turning a box into a mountain, or as they are turning a ramp into a large hill that has to be climbed. They're managing the activity and the development of the scenario. They're a director, of course, because they're also managing the behavior of the other kids. And you can see this whenever any child in the group steps out of their appropriate role only to receive a disdainful response from another child, something like, "You can't say that, babies don't talk." They're directing the behavior of other people as well as managing their own actions. And of course, in addition to being actors, stage managers, and directors, most of these children are script writers as well, because as the dramatic scenario is unfolding, children are evolving the narrative in new and interesting ways. And so the ability to do that far outstrips the capacities of any child who might be egocentric at that age, because it requires an acute understanding of what's going on with other children as it relates to your own conduct. And of course, the other thing that is really interesting about children's pretend play are the ways in which the themes that emerge in their play reflect the kinds of issues that they're interested in, that they're pondering, that they're perplexed by, that they're trying to find out more about, whether it has to do with family roles, or whether they're enacting themes of illness and getting better, perhaps remembering some time a few weeks ago that they had the flu. Sometimes their play involves being super and what that's like. It can involve themes of shared deviance, robbing a bank, doing other bad things, and imagining what it would be like if you did that. But in all cases, pretend play is giving us insight into the thinking, the understanding, and the social interaction skills of young children. Excuse me. In all these contexts, children are learning about sharing, they're learning about assertiveness, they're learning about caring for other children, especially children who have become upset or distressed. They're learning about status, something I'll say a little bit more about in just a moment, about where you stand in relation to others in the group. They're learning about cooperation. Remarkable social skills for children so young. One of the characteristics that begins to emerge in children's peer relationships toward the end of the preschool years and really begins to flourish in the grade school years is social comparison. One of the reasons that young children can often be feeling so good about themselves and about what they can do is that they're often not comparing themselves with other children of the same age. Rather, they're comparing what they can do now with what they couldn't do just a few months or years ago. Children, of course, have a wonderfully sunny, optimistic view of themselves when they're thinking about how much their own skills and abilities are growing. And of course, that's something we encourage as preschool and early childhood educators. But along about the end of the preschool years, children adopt a more exacting standard of comparison, standard of evaluation for themselves. They start looking at what they can do, not in relation to what they couldn't do earlier, but in relation to what other kids of the same age can do. And of course, this is a more exacting standard because you can't always do all the things that other 5-year-olds can do. And children quickly realize that in some respects they are doing just fine, and in other respects they don't measure up. And of course, this is something that a characteristic social comparison that really begins to emerge full bore in the grade school years as children are in academic settings that increasingly involve both explicit and implicit comparisons of children's abilities with those of other children in the classroom. And then finally, a brand new issue that we're beginning to understand about children's peer relationships has to do with emotion regulation skills. And what we're beginning to realize is that the skills that enable you to manage your feelings and your emotions well at home are not necessarily the same tools or skills that are going to enable you to manage your emotions well in the peer group. That there are different rules in each setting. You know, if you're at home and your older brother walks by and swats you, you may well decide that you want to wail plaintively and loudly in order to attract the attention of parents who then punish the older brother. But if you do the same thing in a peer environment of an early childhood classroom, you may well find other kids responding unsympathetically to you and teachers wondering why you're making such a loud sound. Or they may also comfort you, but take you away from what it is that you were doing. So children are having to learn that emotion regulation is a different thing with peers than it is in the home environment. And we're just beginning to understand how they learn those skills and what those different toolkits might be for each setting. So we've been talking about some of the unique social and emotional skills that children have to acquire. But in addition to this, Children are developing during the preschool years unique kinds of social understanding. In other words, they're developing expectations and skills for conceptualizing their interactions with other kids. One of these has to do with the skills of social problem solving. It kind of like that story I told you a few moments ago about Josh and the missile robot. Those kinds of problem-solving skills are really beginning to develop in the early childhood years and will continue to flourish in the middle childhood years. They involve accurately decoding other people's social cues, like when another child is getting upset and you didn't expect it. They involve making judgments about how other people will respond if you act in a particular way. They involve judgments about not only deciding how to respond, but then interpreting others' responses to your behavior to make sure that your problem solving has been successful or not. And one of the things we're learning is that children who vary in their status, in their popularity, in their abilities to get along with other kids, also vary in these social problem solving skills. Take, for example, a situation in which you're standing in line and you've got a cup of Coke in your hand. And as you're standing in line, people are jostling and moving around, and somebody accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, hits your arm. The Coke spills all over your wrist, and now you're looking around to see what happened. Well, at that moment, of course, you're also trying to figure out why that took place. Were you simply accidentally shoved as people were moving around the line and moving all around you? Or was somebody deliberately trying to make you spill your drink all over your hand? And that's a process of social inference that we do all the time. Children are also making those judgments in everyday social situations. One of the things we've learned about kids who get into a lot of trouble with other children because of their aggressive behavior is that they're more likely to see that act as a deliberately hostile act that some other child intended, rather than to dismiss it as an accident, as most of us do. And so those kinds of social problem-solving skills have a lot to do with how children's social interaction abilities are shaped and their overall abilities to get along constructively with other kids. As any parent knows, of course, during the preschool years, children are also learning a lot about fairness and rights. Anytime you hear a child protesting, "That's not fair," in response to a judgment or a decision that a parent has made, it's not just that children are sort of offering a ready-made protest. It's that they really do think about what is really fair. And of course, this is something philosophers have debated for centuries. Does fairness mean that everybody gets the same thing? Does fairness mean that everybody gets according to what they need? Does fairness mean that everybody gets according to how much they've contributed? Well, children begin thinking about that in the preschool years. And oftentimes it's a classroom setting in which they're thinking about those issues. And finally, of course, there's the issue of friendship and understanding what friendship is all about. Children are developing friends in their preschool experiences and early childhood classroom, and they are doing so with a developing sense about what a friend is, about the degree to which a friendship is something in which other people or another child does nice things for you, or whether it involves a reciprocal obligation that you have to the other person. And so these ideas are just beginning to take hold for kids in the preschool years. There's a lot going on in children's peer relationships, and we develop more of a sense of more of an appreciation of the depths of their social and emotional understanding by looking at the development of these social and emotional skills and these kinds of understandings of their peers in this area more than almost any other. Of course, not all children fare so well in their interactions with other children. And we can begin to see in the preschool years the emergence of problems in children's peer relationships. And so researchers have devoted a lot of attention to identifying those kids who are already showing problems in getting along with other kids, the kinds of children with deficient social skills that might, with some attention and some effort, be improved, be remedied in such a way that children can move into a more positive track in their interactions with other kids. To do so, of course, we first have to identify who are the kids who are beginning to have difficulties in their interactions with other children. We have to identify, in other words, different kinds of peer status. And researchers who have done so have used a deceptively simple method for trying to understand where children stand in relation to other kids in the classroom or in a playgroup. Quite simply, what they will do is to give a child a picture board with all the other kids in the classroom or all the other kids in the group, and they'll ask the child to nominate 3 kids that they would most like to play with, given the opportunity. And they will also ask the child to identify 3 kids they would least like to play with. So, nominations for 3 that you most like to play with, nominations of 3 others that you would least like to play with. And on the basis of that, researchers have identified several different kinds of peer status. And these can be found in older preschoolers as well as grade school kids. We find, first of all, that a small group of children are identified as being popular. And these are the ones who get a lot of positive nominations from other children in the group, but few negative nominations. In addition, you can identify kids who are called in this research controversial. These are kids who have many positive nominations, are identified as someone that other kids want to play with, but also a lot of negative nominations, and that's why they're called controversial. Of these 2, guess who is most likely to be the group leader? It turns out not to be the popular kids, but rather the controversial ones. Perhaps because the combination of being popular, but also being watched with some wariness and respect by the others, thrusts them into that kind of a leadership role. Now, there's a third group of kids who have been identified using this peer nomination procedure. And these are called the neglected kids. These are ones who have few positive nominations, but they also have few negative nominations. They are, in a sense, off the radar screen for most of the other kids in the group. Now, at the beginning of this research field, we used to have a lot of concern about the neglected kids in reflecting our typical American tendency, I think, to believe that if children weren't well socially integrated, they had a problem. Researchers were worried about whether these neglected kids were somehow being pushed aside by the other kids in the group. We now no longer have those concerns, because what researchers have realized is that neglected kids do not see themselves as being excluded. They certainly don't feel lonely. What they are simply the kinds of kids who don't feel a strong need to be right at the center of the social network. They are comfortable being at the periphery and then entering into things as they choose. So we have much less concern about neglected kids than we used to. It seems that these are kids who are going to go ahead and become, and are well adjusted, but they are simply not the ones who are right at the middle of the social mainstream. Now, our reassurance is not extended to the next group of kids in this set of peer status categories. And these are the ones who are identified as rejected because of their aggressive conduct. These are kids with few positive nominations, but many negative nominations, and the reason they get a lot of negative nominations is because of their aggressive behavior toward other kids. And these are the kids who research has shown are on a very bad developmental pathway as it relates to peer interactions, and indeed as it relates to a lot of problems they may face later in life in terms of the development of conduct problems as they move through the elementary school years. These are kids who, using the illustration I used earlier of somebody jostling you in line and spilling your Coke all over your wrist, are most likely to assume that when something like that happens, there was somebody else there who was deliberately and with hostility trying to make them spill their drink. And it's because of this hostile attribution bias that rejected aggressive kids have that causes them to lash out at other children in circumstances where others may not think that there was a big offense, and to become known among other kids for their aggressive behavior. Remarkably enough, kids in this category often don't think they have a problem. Often it's because other kids back away from them, give them a lot of room because of their propensity for aggression. Excuse me. And often it's because they think that the trouble they have with other kids is not because of their fault, but because of the problems that other kids are creating for them. Now there's another rejected group that we also have concerns about. And these are the ones who are called rejected withdrawn or rejected submissive. These are kids who again have few positive nominations, lots of negative nominations, but in this case, it's because of their shy and hesitant, but probably more accurately we should call it socially inept behavior. These are the kids who seem to be awkward, who seem to be ill at ease, and make other kids feel ill at ease in their company. And it's because of this kind of shy, awkward, withdrawn, socially incompetent behavior that these kids also tend to be rejected by others in the group. Sadly enough, if for every bully you need to have a victim, and if the rejected aggressive kids are more likely to be the bullies in the group, it is the rejected withdrawn or submissive kids who are more likely to be the victims. These kids are lonely. These kids are the ones who feel like they are being excluded by others. And they are the ones who are often sad and distressed because of the status they accurately perceive they have with other kids. And fortunately, there have been developed a number of strategies, many of which can be implemented in an early childhood classroom, to help children who are showing undue amounts of aggressive behavior and to help kids who are already showing signs of social ineptness and awkwardness to develop the kinds of social skills that will help them get along more constructively and more positively with other kids. So this body of research, which is focused on identifying kids who have different characteristics in their interactions with other kids, has also fruitfully given us tools for helping to assist children who are already having these kinds of interaction difficulties with their peers. And then finally, the last of these peer status categories are the average kids. Everybody else, most of the kids in the group, people like you and me, who are right in the mainstream of the social network. So that's some of what we've learned about the nature of children's peer relationships, especially in the preschool years. It's a body of knowledge that helps us understand both how remarkably sophisticated and competent children are in their interactions with other kids, how much growth takes place during the preschool years in their abilities to interact in a positive and constructive way, to manage conflict appropriately, but also how this is a period when we can see, and for some kids, fortunately a few, the emergence of what may be enduring problems in their peer relationships that hopefully we can identify and help to remedy early on. So let's talk a little bit about, therefore, what might be some of the practical implications of what we've learned. In other words, how can we help young children develop better skills in their peer relationships? Well, one way we can do so is to simply model on our own part the kinds of cooperative, constructive social interaction skills that we want children to show toward each other, and then also to explain why we are acting in this way. It can often be helpful for children to be able to look to us for examples of the kind of conduct that we're also encouraging them through our words, but also through our example, for them to show in relation to each other. So for a teacher, for example, who is working with a block of clay in a table where other children are doing the same thing, and another child wants to join in, it's not only a matter of saying, let's let Josie join us because in our classroom we want everybody to participate, but then also to share their block of clay with Josie so that everybody can have some clay to play with. And likewise, to be able to talk about taking turns as you, the teacher, are modeling this activity for other children in the classroom. Likewise, we can also use our words to help children understand each other, especially when they're in conflict, but also in lots of other social interaction situations. As I said earlier, with respect to the development of social and emotional understanding, our ability to put words onto the feelings and the thoughts and the intentions and the goals and the desires of other kids can not only help them understand each other, but can help them begin to develop a knowledge about why other people act and behave as they do in everyday social interactions. Of course, when children are in conflict, helping through our words for children to understand each other can put them on the pathway toward resolving their conflict. But there are other social situations in which those words can be useful as well. As my wife has pointed out, when a child is being perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally excluded by a group of kids who are playing together, say in the dress-up area, it can be helpful for a teacher to talk about what that excluded child might be feeling, about how much they want to join the group and how hard it can be, and yet how much she's watching the others to see if she might get an opportunity to join them, can make the other children aware of somebody who they may have just been ignoring, or because of the lack of cognitive flexibility, not have been thinking about because of their immersion in their own play. We can, of course, work with children to use and practice conflict negotiation skills. This is another good reason why it can be helpful to refer children to each other to resolve conflict, where we, in our role as kind of a translator, an interpreter, and kind of a nudge, can help move them along toward thinking about different strategies toward resolving their conflict, and help them in coming up with those solutions to both own them and to be able to enact them. We can, of course, also praise models of cooperative conduct among children as we draw attention to all aspects, all kinds of positive conduct that they're showing in relation to each other. And in doing so, in offering a child as an example of the kind of behavior we hope that all children will enact, it's always good to articulate the general principle, to talk about the general rule about why we're sharing and why we're taking turns, so that children have that in mind as well. Now, here's a strategy that I hadn't thought about until I started doing some research for this talk, and that is the idea of teachers helping to introduce social complexity into children's pretend play stories in such a way as to shift the narrative to help children face a different kind of a challenge and perhaps also bring their play up to a new level. If this is a story, for example, in which children are enacting family roles, the teacher might enter in as another family member and in the course of the subsequent play introduce new themes, introduce new ideas into the play, and in that way help to stretch children's experience of that and some of their social skills as well. We can also use books and puppet stories and discussions to talk about peer interaction, about getting along with others and other kinds of peer processes. There are many, many children's stories out there with social and emotional themes that can be used to illustrate, the ideas of loyalty and of conflict negotiation, issues of inclusion and exclusion in the group, and what happens when children get mad or what happens when children get upset with each other. That can provide a forum for being able to talk about these ideas during circle time, as well as to help talk about these experiences as children encounter them. And finally, we can coach social skills in children who have peer difficulties, as well as communicating with parents about these efforts. For Janet and me, our firstborn son, Scott, was a painfully shy child who very much wanted to join other kids, but really had difficulty figuring out how to become part of the group when he was so timid. And I can remember that both Janet and I spent a lot of time with Scott actually rehearsing peer initiation or peer entry skills so that he would have a broader repertoire of possible strategies to use the next time he was in the block area and wanting to join a couple of other boys who were building with the blocks, which was for him a favorite activity. So that kind of coaching is something that teachers can do as well as parents, and can be one way of really helping children to broaden their repertoire of social skills, because with a broadened repertoire, children have multiple options with which to interact with other kids. Well, this is just the beginning of some ideas that I hope have perhaps stimulated some of your own. So if you're in a situation where you can do so, let me encourage you to turn to some of the people next to you and consider what are the implications of what we've learned about children's peer interactions for teachers, and how teachers work with kids in an early childhood classroom? What are the implications for children in their learning these social skills themselves? What are the implications for parents in trying to encourage children's social competence in the early childhood years?